Hello, back again to discuss the city, the Bible and the city. In our first video of this little series, we talked about how the Bible in the book of Genesis portrays the city. And we came to the conclusion that the city is usually portrayed in a very negative light. The reason for this is twofold. Number one, that the city was the place where sinful people dwelled, and therefore the city was a center of evil and idolatry, as in the case of Babel, and Sodom and Gomorrah. But then secondly, the people of God were more rural. They were more pastoral. They were shepherds rather than city dwellers. So we see that in Genesis, we have a very rural culture with a very deep mistrust of cities. And not that the city itself is a bad thing, but it's the place where a lot of sinful and evil people dwell. Now we want to look at the next phase of Israelites' history and the next phase of God's revelatory plan. We want to look at the time period between the Exodus and the monarchy. And this is a very long period of time. It's 400 years plus. But Israel's life didn't change a whole lot during this time period. Let's get you up to speed on what happens, and then we'll talk about how the cities play into it. In the 15th century BC, sometime in the 1400s, God miraculously delivers his people from Egypt out of slavery. For 40 years, they wander in the wilderness, moving from place to place, fighting off enemies, surviving in the desert, until they are able, at God's direction, to enter into the promised land. Once they enter into the promised land, they have to fight their way in and fight their way through. As long as they're faithful to God, God gives them victory. But when they are disobedient, as in the case of Achan at the Battle of Jericho, which transitioned on over into the Battle of Ai, God gives them defeat until they're able to purge away the sin that's causing that defeat. So they slowly conquer the promised land, not in the way God has designed, but in the way of their own designing. And then we get to the period of the Judges, where I think one of the most telling scriptures in the whole Old Testament. It says, "In that day there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." They had taken over the land. They had inhabited the cities of the Philistines and the countryside. I'm sorry, not of the Philistines, but of the Canaanites. They had inhabited their cities. They inhabited their countryside. But yet they were constantly under attack from enemy tribes nearby, like the Philistines or the Amalekites or the Ammonites or Moabites. All of these folks were always constantly pressing against them. And Israel was never able to be fully secure. Remember, back in our introductory video, one of the benefits of the city was security, that people who dwelt in the city could be secure in where they were. Well, for that 400 years between the Exodus and the coming of Saul, the first king, Israel didn't have security. They wandered, or nothing was really and truly permanent. They had not yet captured Jerusalem. It wasn't until David's time that Jerusalem, the city of the Jebusites, was captured. Another telling feature is that their worship was temporary. Remember that on Mount Sinai, God instructed Moses on the construction of a tabernacle. And this tabernacle was a tent. It was a movable tent that was used as the center of God's worship and the place in the camp where God dwelt. You will notice that as you read the books of Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges, you will see this idea of camp over and over and over again. It's a place of temporary dwelling. It's a makeshift city that is not permanent. The tabernacle was a makeshift temple that was not permanent. And the period between the Exodus and the Kings was a period of yearning for permanence, a period of yearning for a place to call home. They were always on the move and never fully secure. And that's what we see time after time when we look at this second key period of Old Testament history, this impermanence. As they wandered in the wilderness, God revealed to Moses how things would be in the promised land. One of the things that we see in Numbers chapter 35, near the end of the book of Numbers, near the end of their sojourn in the wilderness, is that the Levites, the priestly tribe, would not be given land. Instead, they would be given cities. And that is very important. That is a huge shift in the way previously that God's revelation has shown cities. And this is our first glimpse that cities aren't evil in and of themselves, because the Levites were the people that God had specifically chosen to be his priests and ministers and servants in his tabernacle, and later, once Solomon comes, in his temple. So these Levites were not given land. They were not to be farmers. They were not to be shepherds. They were to be city dwellers. And their income would come as a result of the tithe of those who were farmers and shepherds. They would give a tenth of their increase to God, who then would turn it over to be the possession of the Levite, the servant of God, who was not given the rural farming, herding means to take care of his own family. He had to depend on God, and he lived in cities. There were Levitical cities scattered throughout the land, and this is a very important point, and it's a shift in the way we see the city. Here we see God's servants in the cities, instead of God's servants like Abraham and the sons of Israel and others fleeing the city. Here we see God's servants embracing the city for the first time. Not only that, but we also see in that same 35th chapter of Numbers the creation of the cities of refuge. If someone shed the life of someone else in an accidental manner, to avoid the old lex talionis, the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, limb for a limb, and life for a life, they could run to one of the cities of refuge and dwell safely there. Now we see the city as being a center of safety, as well as for the Levites, a center for the worshipful. Now the city is beginning to take shape in a redeemed form in the law. No longer is it the for lack of a better word, and I think you'll all understand what I mean, no longer is the city the wild, wild west. The city is now being tamed by the law and the purpose of God, and corralled back into what it was originally intended to be, a place of safety, a place of socialization, and a place of worship. But again, it's not always that way. When Israel enters the Promised Land and begins the conquest, the great conquest of Canaan, the first place they get to is Jericho. And Jericho is that ancient city with the great walls that they marched around 7 times and blew the trumpets and the walls came tumbling down. We're all familiar with that. But Jericho and Ai and Bethel and all the other places that were fortified in that ancient Canaanite land were cities. The Canaanites depended on the city for safety and security too. And it was a place, again, where evil people congregated. The people who opposed God and the people who opposed what he wanted to do. So we see a mixed bag of the way the city is represented in this period of time. Sometimes it's good, as with the dwelling of the Levites and the cities of refuge. But then again, sometimes it's bad, as in Joshua chapter 6 with the Philistines. And not only that, but in Judges chapter 20, the wicked Benjamites dwelt in cities in Joshua chapter 20. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, the wicked Philistines dwelt in cities. The 5 cities of the Philistines: Ekron, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, and Gath were the 5 great evil cities of the Philistines. And the Philistines dwelt in cities. So here we get a bit of a mixture we see the effects of the law and the gift of God showing what cities could be with the Levites dwelling there, and with the cities of refuge being places of safety for the unfortunate manslayer. But then we also see the reality that is somewhat continued from the times of Genesis, that the city is still in reality an unredeemed thing. It's still full of evil people, like the people of Jericho, even though Jericho wasn't all evil because Rahab was there, and she let the spies in and helped them. But then we also see the wicked Benjamites, we also see the Philistines dwelling in cities. And so we still have an agricultural, agrarian people, still somewhat mistrustful of the city, but at the same time now they have a little bit armed with what the city could be and some of the redeeming features. That'll do it for this video, as we've moved from the Exodus up to the time of the monarchy. Now, in our next video, we will finish out the rest of the Old Testament and show that the city becomes even more redeemed as we move into the time, especially of the great King David. So hang tight, and we'll keep going, and I hope you're enjoying this. Have a good day.